So as you know, and for those who are joining for the first time, this year we decided to open up our Impact Lab sessions to discuss some of our core concepts, and also to be able to allow other people in the broader Oxford community, and while we're online, the broader virtual community, to be able to participate and meet some of our Impact Lab special guests and speakers that we'll be learning from this year. So systems change is fast becoming a buzzword in the social impact community. And at the Skoll Centre, systems change is one of our core concepts. And for those students who will be engaging with us this year, you will also be able to interact with our systems change programming through GoTo, Map the System, Impact Lab, and the Systems Change Observatory. So what do we mean when we talk about systems change? We often speak about systems change, systems thinking, and systems leadership all together. And when we think about systems change, we think sort of beyond an organization or a single problem, but really to understand the whole in all of its complexity. And last week we discussed a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals and how complex and wicked those problems are. We call them wicked problems. And we look at systems change as the way that not only SDGs by themselves, but also how they connected to each other in a complex structure. So part of our systems thinking, we really think that systems thinkers should be able to do some or of the following areas. So to be able to identify large systems, different ways really to think about, to change from linear thinking to circular mindset, ways of influence within a system, really understanding different feedback loops, understanding a landscape and different trends, mapping out a complex system, which is what we do in our Map the System competition, and also understanding self in system, which is how we explore a lot of the work around Impact Lab and Leading for Impact, which is another program we run about understanding yourself within a system. So today we're going to hear from two of our postdoc researchers at the Systems Change Observatory, which is a research project at the Skoll Centre. The Systems Change Observatory aims to build a community of practice and research on long-term systems change in the social impact space, including pathways, challenges, and solutions as well. So when we think about systems change, it fits in a number of ways into the Impact Lab program. And what I want to do here is scaffold not just how we scaffold this knowledge within the Impact Lab itself, but with it also some of the sessions that you have interacted with in these open series and going to interact with as we move forward. So we really started with systems leadership, the conversation we had with Peter Baljeet and Martin Kulungabanda. And we looked at understanding self for a little bit within a system. And then we went with Hendry Majid into understanding complex problems and using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framing to really frame those concept problems and understand what are we talking about when we talk about these types of problems that need to be solved. And then we don't want to just look at these problems in isolation. We need to understand them through systems thinking. And so this session is going to build upon the complex problems into what is systems thinking approaches and concepts. So it's going to be more of a taster session on what you can expect with an Impact Lab. And then from this session, we're going to be moving next week into understanding inequalities in systems, which will be working with one of our Skoll fellows, Tara Sebra Collier. We're going to be looking at impact investing as a lens to understand inequalities within systems, and we'll be looking at gender lens investing and investing for racial equity as well. So I know that's a little bit of a mouthful, and I'm going to move on now to introducing our two postdoc researchers, which we're really lucky to have with us here today. So our first doc researcher I'm going to introduce is Paulo Savaget. He is a postdoc researcher at the Skoll Centre working on the Systems Change Observatory. He has a PhD from Cambridge University, and he is a Gates Scholar as well. Paulo is a lecturer, a consultant, an entrepreneur, and a researcher. He started an award-winning startup in Brazil and has worked extensively across Africa and Latin America. He taught Systems Change and Impact Lab last year and will be joining us again this year. He looks specifically at sustainability, systems hacking, which is a really interesting approach, which was really well received last year. We also joined by a new postdoc researcher, which is Sudhir Rama Murthy. Sudhir again works with the Systems Change Observatory at the Skoll Centre. He has a PhD in engineering from Cambridge University in sustainable manufacturing. He is also a council fellow at the World Economic Forum. His interests lie in responsible business and supply chain management. This year, he'll be joining the Skoll Centre's Impact Lab module, really at bringing supply chain thinking, specifically around supply chain's reactions to COVID-19, which brings in a really relevant response. Very, very well connected to what we spoke about last week with some of the businesses that we discussed integrating the Sustainable Development Goals. And we came up with some examples of how supply chains and COVID-19 right now is something that is really interesting for us to look at in sustainable business. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paolo and Sudhir. What I would like you to do is that if you have any questions, you're welcome to pop them into the chat box as we go along, and then we'll collate them, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers a little bit later on in the session. Thank you very much. Paolo, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to see all these new faces and some familiar faces as well. Today, we're going to give you a taste on systems change, a taste based on our research, but also on very established ideas in the field. I want to start by asking you to engage with a perspective from engineering. So try to adopt an engineer hat here as if you were designing a hardware. So let's say you're going to design a hard drive. You're going to look at the boundary. So where exactly, what am I going to talk about? It's here, it's within this plastic case. What are the components that are going in? How are they interconnected? What are the flows between all these components, ranging from cables to all these microchips and electronic devices? And what is the main purpose of this hard drive? What performance do I expect from this? This is a closed system. It has a specific purpose. The boundary is very conventional. We are pretty much sure like what it should look like at this stage. And the components in interconnections may change a bit, but they don't change that much the performance. They improve the performance, but qualitatively, we know what to expect from a hard drive. If you expand the boundaries from hard drive to the laptop where the hard drive is, you're gonna expand the boundaries, but also expand the number of components and the interconnections and the purpose, like the performance that you expect from the laptop. Of course, like this is a kind of system analysis. The laptop that we're talking about here, in this case, it has some specific performances that you expect, but by zooming out from the hard drive to a laptop, it becomes a bit more complex. The more things that can go wrong. If there's something wrong with the memory stick, then the other things are not going to work in isolation, right? But still, looking at systems with a technical lens like we are doing here is much less complex than if you look at things like this, right? If you add more social perspectives to systems thinking and system analysis, things become much more complicated, actually more complex, not only complicated. So let's say they're going to frame the problem and you're going to frame the boundaries using the same categories I mentioned before. So I want to eradicate poverty in the world. That's the boundary. And then you're going to say, like, what are the main components, the main actors, the main agents? How are they interconnected? What is the performance? In this performance, I framed based on the ultimate goal of eradicating poverty, right? But the system can be, for example, how to eliminate diarrhea in Zambia or how to fight racism in the United States, right? The purposes we have pretty much shape how we're going to frame the boundaries, what are the components we're going to be looking at, how they're interconnected. And most importantly, when we look at these kinds of social issues or social technical, when we look at technologies, but within a social context, a very complex social context, many emergent features arise. And that's the beauty of systems changes, that we start analyzing these complexities, these uncertainties that shape our analysis and shape how we're gonna make decisions. Because many times, if we make decisions without considering these emergent features of systems, the things we're gonna try to do are gonna fail. And the many failure cases, right? Like doing, if you try to address an issue, not necessarily it's gonna happen, right? Like an action doesn't necessarily lead to the reaction that you expected from the beginning, because there are many uncertainties, many things that we know we don't know, but also things that we don't know until we actually try to do it. And also many things that prevent our action to result in what we expected from the beginning. And we're going to cover a few of these complexities. So starting with the maxim of systems change, that a system is more than the sum of its parts. Let me give you an example. I'm from Brazil, as Brian introduced me. Our country is renowned worldwide for being a bit corrupt. So let's say that I'm going to look at the political system and try to avoid or prevent corruption. That's my analytical framing here. And then I may start with elected governments, but I'm going to say like, no, but the many other players, perhaps construction companies that are funding the politicians, or the key players, intermediaries that impact on corruption in the government. And then I draw my system. I try to identify the whole. I'm happy with it. I see the interconnections between these agents. And then I'm going to say, okay, how can I address corruption? Perhaps I'm going to focus on getting rid of the corrupt politicians. And then you go and you get rid of a corrupt politician. That doesn't mean that the system will become less corrupt. That's what I mean by the system is more than the sum of its parts. Because the system, let's say that you get rid of a corrupt politician, the system might react in a way that will make the system even more corrupt. Because, for example, let's say that you found out about corruption and you convicted a politician, the system might become more complex. The corruption schemes might become more sophisticated in order to hide and to prevent people from being arrested. So the reactions when acting on systems are not necessarily what we expect. And it's not only acting on the components. It's not only summing the components that we're going to identify the whole. That's one of the maxims of systems change. Other issue here is that problems are very poorly specified. Let me give you an example. When I worked with indigenous and traditional populations in Brazil, I engaged with a civil servant that told me a story of a time that she was going to talk to a community leader, a tribal leader, and tell him something that she thought was amazing, because this tribe was systematically evicted from the lands they inhabited. But she thought that like she had found an amazing solution to the problem, because she negotiated with a bunch of people, and the land that they were going to be evicted, they were actually going to be evicted, but she was going to provide, or the government was going to provide, a much bigger land that was more fertile as well, much better, right? And then she went to the tribal leader and said, hey, I know that we're evicting you from this land, but we just came up, like through these engagements here with the government, we got you a better land. It's much bigger and it's much more fertile. And the tribal leader looked at her and said, if I offered you a better mom, would you trade yours? So the problem that she had specified in the beginning was they are being evicted from the land. The land represents where they eat, where they grow things and so on. If I offer them a bigger land where they can grow more things, they can build more houses, it's going to be better for them. But the reality is that the problem for them is very different. The land for them, actually in the native language, means where it can exist. If they don't inhabit in that specific land, they can no longer exist. And in fact, this tribe has the highest suicide rates in the entire world because of that, because they have been systematically evicted from the lands where they can exist. So I'm giving you a very specific example, but you can imagine that that applies to all kinds of ranges of examples and problems that we face that are very complex. Problems are, and the characteristics of systems, you see a lot of self-reinforced behaviors, and that applies to all kinds of systems. Like look at human body, for example. The more I eat croissants, the more I want to eat croissants, right? Like I get completely addicted and carbs, and I keep eating carbs. But that applies to almost everything. Like the more we violate the rights of indigenous populations, the more it becomes normal to violate the rights. Or the more, for example, you're walking down the streets in a very polluted region, it might feel normal to throw trash, right, in the middle of the streets. You're never going to do that in the middle of SBS because it's self-reinforced. The cleaner the place is, the cleaner it tends to be. The dirtier the place is, the dirtier it tends to be. Systems are self-reinforced. And also they are constantly changing. We assume that systems are very inertial, and there are some inertial characteristics, like some problems that are inertial. Poverty existed since the beginning of human life. But also they're constantly changing. Just look around and see the many technologies and many changes in social behavior that we have experienced over our lives. The problem is that they don't necessarily change for better, and they're not necessarily intentional changes or coordinated changes. So the one challenge here in terms of what we can do is, how are we going to change something that is already changing, right? Like, and is it steering change towards a direction that is more desirable? Or is it actually halting what is negative? Or is it disrupting the status quo or an incumbent system that we dislike? There are many different approaches towards changing something that is already changing, not only directly acting on it, but sometimes it involves governance and steering and many different ways of acting and behaving. This is pretty obvious, but things are essentially interconnected. And that has implications for how we operate as well. So for example, one of the most successful global health initiatives ever was polio eradication, almost eradication, like from the mid-80s until 2017, I think, 99% of cases were, it reduced by 99% the number of cases of polio. Extremely successful, many, like a huge coalition, many big players, and they vaccinated a bunch of people, even in the remotest places on Earth. But like, if we created these structures to deliver polio vaccines, why haven't we used the same structures to provide bed nets for malaria or yellow fever? Or why haven't we vaccinated for other diseases since these systems were already in place? Healthcare is interconnected, right? People feel healthy or not, it's not necessarily a single disease, but the ways we structure our actions are siloed by projects, by certain conventional structures. So not only problems are interconnected, but many times we fail to address interconnected issues because of the ways we structure our projects or our actions. This is also very, and Brown mentioned this in the beginning in her introduction, systemic problems cannot be solved by a single organization. They can be addressed by a single organization, but not fully solved. Not even the most powerful ones. Like, it would be very naive to think, for example, that the Gates Foundation by itself can fully eradicate poverty, right? Or that the United States government can solve climate change. It's simply not going to happen. It involves a lot of coordination. It involves deep changes in how people behave, the technologies we have, and so on and so forth. There's also no single solution. So like, many times you see people coming up with solutions that are some sorts of silver bullets. Like, hybrid cars are not going to solve climate change. They might help, right? And also, since it's interconnected, to have hybrid cars and to diffuse hybrid cars, we are going to need a lot of other changes in fueling stations that will have to provide different kinds of fuel, right? Like, we're going to have other kinds of policies, supportive infrastructures, and so on. So the single idea of having a silver bullet solution to a systemic problem is also very naive, and it simply won't happen. It doesn't mean that we cannot get things done. I just want to highlight this. Many times we just have to get things done, and there will be effects on the system, but we're going to cover that later. When we look at systems then, like, and you might be asking yourself, if it's so complex, how can we actually act on systems? And one of the maxims of systems change as well is that we might not be able to fully design a complex system. We might be able to design a laptop or a hard drive, right? Like a system that is less complex or that reduces complexity over time since we improve your technical performance. But when you address very broad social issues, they are very complex and uncertainty, and it's more about managing masses than actually coming up with a solution to the problems. And problems evolve, right? Like think of poverty. Poverty 50 years ago is completely different from poverty now. Like now poverty is below $1.25 per day. $1.25 per day 100 years ago was a lot of money. So and imagine the consumption patterns as well, how they have changed, right? Like, or the kinds of livelihoods we have, life expectancy. We raise the bars of what we expect. And that also is part of this evolving nature of systems change and the way of appraising and acting on systems. We have to address expectations and constantly manage these masses that cannot be fully untangled. There are many approaches towards systems change that have been addressed or tried to be addressed by literature. There's a lot of literature, especially since the 50s, that describe more closed, controllable system. For example, there's a tradition that grew a lot at MIT, coming from cybernetics, that was focused on systems dynamics. You map a system, you see what are the key components, the interconnections between them, the desired performance, and then you see how you can bring agents together, or how you can connect them better, or what agents you have to bring from outside that boundary. So it's pretty much that way of looking at systems. Other kinds of literature were much like they added complexity by looking at these kinds of things that I just described, like all these emergent features that add complexity and that we have to pay attention before making decisions. And especially because we also started to become more aware of wicked problems or grand challenges or sustainability problems, pretty much like these problems that are pervasive, that are persistent, inertial, that are very difficult to address. There's no single solution, right? Like all these kinds of problems motivated our understanding on systems change, bringing a system lens towards addressing problems. There are some emergent themes today that you see in systems literature. So one, for example, you might know that the Skoll Centre has an initiative called Map the System. We are constantly trying to understand and map the whole. It's not trivial to understand what is the whole, because it depends on how you draw your boundaries. And you will end up thinking about who you're gonna left aside or who you're gonna integrate into your system. And of course, that has several implications, right? The unintended consequences. So for example, if you do, and this is something that grew a lot. For example, you might have shoes from the company Tom's that gives a pair for free for each pair that they sell. A lot of people started discussing the unintended consequences of Tom's shoes, right? That they, by giving free pairs in places that are very poor, they completely compromise the textile industries of the places where they were. So these kinds of things are not trivial. We don't necessarily think about them, but when we adopt the system lens, we start seeing these interconnections. It's not simply giving pairs of shoes to the poor that you're going to address an issue. Perhaps the issue is going to be intensified because these people were working in local textile industries that might have been compromised. And these systems complexities, these emergent properties that we just described, like they come under different names, different jargons, like feedback loops, for example, but the ideas are pretty similar to what I just described, these uncertainties, these sorts of complexities. And all these different traditions end up asking the same kind of question: how can we intervene, and should we intervene in the first place in systems that are already changing? There's no single answer to this, but there's a lot of interesting research avenues that can be pursued. And among those is the research that we're doing at the SEO, and SEO, an acronym for Systems Change Observatory. We get so used to acronyms at the business school, you're going to see that. Like, I got completely confused when I first joined the business school, but you will eventually catch up. The SEO does research with the aim of impacting not only academia, but also engaging different kinds of stakeholders, practitioners, and so on. It's a relatively recent initiative, and so is the idea of looking at systems change in the social impact space. It's very recent, and we are seeing a convergence of many players, from global funders to ventures on the ground, adopting this language of systems change. And of course, by adopting this language, it implies, or it reflects, changes in how they allocate the resources, how they set their priorities, how they collaborate with others, right? And these are the kinds of questions we are really interested in. We're interested in seeing how these different players see systems change and how they pursue systems change. So what it means, since there's no single definition of what is systems change, but there are implications of the understanding they have of systems change and how they map a system, how they appraise the local components and the interactions and so on, and how they pursue the change that they hope to drive. These are the kinds of questions we ask ourselves. And we have different streams of projects. I'm going to cover the first one, then I'm going to ask my colleague Sudhir to cover the ones that he's in charge of. And this research that we are doing with global funders, we call conceptions of systems change. We are interested in understanding how these global funders in the social impact space, like Gates Foundation, Ashoka, Skoll Foundation, Brock, Lehman, many from the global north, from the global south, some very old like Rockefeller, some very young like Sakin. How do they understand systems change, and what are the kinds of intervention models they have and the actions that they implement towards systems change? Since it's very early stage, we found big convergence to describing that they do systems change, but in reality, what they think systems change is and what they do differs a lot across these global funders. And it's interesting because the premise here is that the approaches from the fundees, the many organizations and individuals that get funds from these global foundations, change based on the premises, the priorities of global funders, right? It's not counterintuitive to think that they are going to echo a bit the priorities and to get resources from these global funders. And here I'm just going to give you a very quick taste, because we have like a lot of different observations from this research, but we coded data from all these foundations that you're seeing here in the slide. And we identified two main conceptions of systems change. So what has to change in order to be called systems change? That's pretty much what we were asking when looking at the data. One of the approaches, and the dominant one, is what we call influencing chains of cause and effect. They are really interested in looking at the root causes of problems. And the idea is we're not going to address only the symptoms of the problem. We want to address the root causes, so the problem is no longer going to be a problem. And it's a very analytical perspective. It normally starts from the deep analysis of a problem that, so let's say you're going to look at structural racism, and then you're going to say, it's not only the person who killed George Floyd, right? Like he's not a rotten apple. It's a systemic problem. Let's look at the root causes of the problem and let's try to address that in a very interconnected way. So that's one of the approaches. It's more problem oriented. The second one, that we call disrupt the status quo, is more driven by a solution. So it's like, we developed this approach or this technology, or we came up with this solution to the marketplace, this new product or service that can change everything. Like by inserting this new technology, or by selling this new product, or making diarrhea treatment available to all kids in Zambia, we are disrupting the status quo. We are changing the system. So these are the two ways, the dominant ways that we identified across all these organizations that you're seeing here on the slide, on how they think that systems, like what has to change in order to be called systems change. And we also found some intervention models. These intervention models refer to the ways they strategize, the ways they allocate resources, what they prioritize when acting on a system. You see here that many of them have this tradition of empowering agents. So the premise here is that we find people that are visionary, people that are special, interconnected, entrepreneurial, and we are gonna promote them, we're gonna give them money, or we're gonna provide them better networks. We're gonna support them in different ways. We're gonna empower these agents because our premise is that they are multipliers of effect, right, of impact. The other ones, there's impacting the ecosystem. So it's the idea that there are many agents, actors in a specific location, but they don't have a condition or an environment that allows them to flourish. So it's to provide supportive infrastructure, it's to provide training, it's to put them together, it's to create an ecosystem where they can flourish and expand their impact. Coordinate agents better is with this premise that this, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many agents out there, they're already doing really interesting stuff, but they're not really exploring the synergies between all these agents. It's like what I said about polio and why haven't we delivered malaria tablets? That would be an idea of coordinating agents better, right? Like, can we use the same structures? Can we connect all these agents that have similar funding structures or different agents that are in different locations? It's this idea that the emphasis lies not only on creating extra capacity, it's putting them together and delivering something. Scale up is a tradition that comes mostly from the Silicon Valley approach of finding unicorns, these organizations that can grow massively. You put money on them and they grow so fast that like the impact grows exponentially and the organization doesn't have to grow as much, the size of the organization. It's a very good impact per investment, good return for your investment. So it's a very financial mentality of investment and very much driven by this IT approach of expanding, exponentializing impact of an organization and growing a lot. So if I already provide malaria tablets in Zambia, why not in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, and so on? So it's this idea of expanding very quickly and with as little resources as possible. And scale deep is a tradition that is more grassroots. So let's engage with the local agents. Let's make ourselves part of the solution. Let's try to change the local policies, the institutions. So it's this approach that is very grounded in local practices that really values the specificities of a context. These are the 5 dominant intervention models that we've identified. So Dave, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Thanks, Paulo. That's a bit of a tough act to follow, but yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Sudhir Ramamurthy, the other postdoctoral research fellow at the center, at the Skoll Centre. Paulo outlined one of the research topics that we are working on, which is the conceptions of systems change, which is at the level of various funders and donors. In the second part, what you see here is about social enterprises and systems change. Here we are taking one slice of that, which you will see on the next slide. For example, we see that we are working with the Skoll Foundation data on this one. On the next slide, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so here, for example, when I say that we are taking one slice of it, the funder is the Skoll Foundation. And this particular foundation has given support to about well over 100 Skoll awardees, which are social enterprises. The list is publicly available on their website. You can find it anyway. So what we are doing here is asking the question, all right, so you have all these social enterprises. How are they thinking of systems change? What are they doing in the communities that they work with? And therefore, how do they pursue systems change? As part of that, one of the questions is, of course, how to measure and manage impact. We are finding quite a few interesting things. And one of the key things to note, which you will find on the next slide, is about organizational footprint. Here, we see that every social enterprise, for example, has grander ambitions of systems change. But it is important, particularly from a practitioner's point of view, to understand the footprint of the organization within the larger system itself. Because in the language of impact, one of the theoretical frameworks which is frequent even among practitioners is about inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. So when we speak of systems change, we are thinking of impact, but we must also be cognizant that the social enterprise itself has a much smaller footprint, where yes, it has certain inputs, there is a certain process within the organization, and there are certain outputs. It is usually easy to have metrics for the inputs and outputs of the organization. It gets a little difficult once you start asking about the outcomes, and then more broadly about, say, impact. So let's say you're tackling malnutrition in India, and you are looking at the number of beneficiaries of a certain product that you are selling. You're still talking about outputs at that stage. But when you come to outcomes, you're talking about what was the benefit to that particular stakeholder because of your intervention as a social enterprise, because of your product. And much more broadly, what was the impact upon the system itself? Did you actually change the system in the longer term? Was that an intervention which got locked in, or did it fade away once you stopped that intervention? So these are some of the broader questions. Of course, at the level of an enterprise, a social enterprise, it is much easier to measure one's own outputs, slightly difficult to measure outcomes, a lot more difficult to measure impact at the level of a system. Of course, this is partly because systems are interconnected, they're complex, you have numerous actors who are making their own decisions, and therefore, what initially starts off as a simple question in terms of how do social enterprises pursue systems change and how do we measure and manage their impact, it gets a little more complicated once you start peeling out the layers. The other bit of work that takes up quite a bit of my enthusiasm is on supply chains. And on the next slide, what we see here is a supply chains perspective to systems change. A lot of the things that we have been discussing here that Paulo and I are speaking about, they may sound rather, theoretically heavy and complicated, but if we were to actually come down to the level of actually what happens in the ground, a supply chain is one particular perspective to understand systems change. It's not the only perspective, but it's helpful in some ways. When we speak of supply chains, just as a one-line summary of a broad field, we are mapping the material, information, capital, and labor. What is the flow of the material, the flow of information, the flow of capital, the use of labor? And increasingly, we also see a fair bit of emphasis on the activities, the value addition activities of each actor. Admitted that a supply chain perspective is a limited view of systems change, but it does offer some clarity and some strengths. For example, what is the boundary of a supply chain? It's fairly easier and straightforward to answer. Do you have tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, tier 3 suppliers? Map out the flow of the material. I have some idea about the boundary of the supply chain. What are the interconnections? Tell me the interconnections in terms of material, information, capital flow, or the use of labor. What are the interventions in a supply chain? Sure, now we have a better way of mapping supply chain. We can understand what interventions are. And of course, performance of a supply chain as well. And performance improvements, which relates to the difficulty of understanding what impact is and whether that impact sticks within a system itself. Again, this may seem a little, these may look like ideas, but actually, when you think of an example, circular economy is one such example, which you will see on the next slide, where we are thinking of, if you were to think of circular economy, again, just a one-line summary, it envisions a restorative and regenerative use of finite resources for the industrial economy. So if you no longer are looking at a linear flow of materials of take, make, use, and dispose, you're instead thinking of waste equals food and how materials can flow in a loop. Of course, there are other ideas, but the central idea is that material waste equals material food. But actually, when you think of circular economy, you actually have a systemic problem of environmental degradation. And you can imagine this. You have numerous enterprises which are trying to make circular economy interventions. Imagine that one person from Said Business School and one person from Blavatnik School of Government, you take both of them and you show them the same environmental degradation problem. It is a systemic problem. It is very complex. It has interconnections. Both of them look at the same problem. The Said Business School person says, hang on a minute, this is a business opportunity. I can make a circular economy intervention. I can set up an enterprise which closes the material loop and therefore tackles this problem of environmental degradation. Yes, that is one particular way of dealing with it. That's one particular intervention. What worked really well was that circular economy, in that sense, you have a system boundary, which then became the supply chain boundary. And therefore, the circular economy intervention was actually a supply chain intervention to tackle a systemic problem. Sure, it looks elegant, but actually, the person from the Blavatnik School of Government may say, hang on a minute, this same problem of environmental degradation is a systemic problem, and I can make a policy intervention. I can go back to Parliament and I can figure out an environmental legislation which tackles the same systemic problem. Both of these are systems change agents in their own space. Both of these are interventions, very different interventions, same problem, slightly overlapping system boundaries. One of the things is we are not saying that there's only one perspective to follow, but to understand that that systems are complex, they are interconnected, and therefore to understand the richness of it, and the more you understand the system, the better your interventions can be and be better coordinated. At this stage, Paulo, on the next slide, we will mention something about what we are thinking of as useful exercises for the next sessions.
Thanks, Sudhir, and please jump in to add as well. We have been planning the next activities and the next sessions on systems change, and what we had in mind, like this was a taste that give you an idea of what is systems change, what are the things you should be looking for, what are the things that we have been working here at the SEO. And now we want to dive a little bit deeper into how you can address systemic issues or how you can act on systems. And we thought of looking a bit at like the opposite sides of the spectrum. One that is more robust action, that involves more coordination, that involves more engagement, and we're gonna do that. And so this is gonna lead that session, bringing more supply chain lens to look at a pandemic response. So very COVID-19 driven. We're gonna look through supply chain lens, bringing a systems perspective to address issues related to the pandemic. And on the other side of the spectrum of more clumsy action that gets things done immediately while simultaneously building up momentum for deeper change, I'm gonna cover my work on hacking, that I was interested in how computer hackers address problems in computer systems and how I learned from them to look at other kinds of problems like poverty, inequality, climate change, and so on and so forth. So we're gonna have a session on workarounds as means of addressing systemic issues, which is this approach I learned from hackers. These are the things that we had planned, but glad to also adapt if you have any suggestion, and also if you have any question on the presentation that we've given today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo and Sudhir. Can we show some appreciation for our speakers today? It's so great to be able to work with the Systems Change Observatory and bring sort of like applied research into the classroom straight away as we are analyzing the data. I think that's we're really in a fortunate position. There's some questions here in the chat box, Paulo. What do you think some of the best historical examples of successful systems change is? So successful systems change. What are some of the best historical examples out there?
That's a really good question. I think the polio intervention is very successful. I only emphasized the synergies or the lack of synergies with other policy interventions, but it was definitely very successful. It pretty much eradicated polio in the world, right? And there are many other similar interventions where you can see that many different players coordinated, delivered a massive result. But like also if you look at the many changes that we've had in the past 50 years in terms, look for example at how we improved our livelihoods, all these things, like systems are constantly changing, not necessarily on purpose to deliver specific sort of performance. But it's interesting to see that there are many different players working not necessarily in a coordinated way that are steering development towards the directions that they consider to be the most adequate or desirable. And I think that's also one of the part of the exercises that we're going to do with you by bringing a supply chain lens to look at how you can act more robustly and coordinating other agents, looking at a big picture, but also a bunch of people doing, like coming up with workarounds to address the issues that they have here and now using the resources they have available at hand. Sudhir, what do you think?
Yes. Yeah, that sounds exciting. Absolutely. In some way related to in the localized supply chains view, one of the things that we are going to be looking at is how, for example, when there was a sudden need for medical ventilators, how Airbus and McLaren, for example, used their engineering expertise to make medical ventilators, which was a local market need. But you also have other situations where LVMH, the fashion brand, for example, they have the expertise of making perfumes. They suddenly repurposed their supply chain to make hand sanitizer gel because, well, guess what? Once you know the chemistry of how to manage alcohol within your products, you can actually repurpose those. And these are some of the ways, some of the examples which we will be diving deeper into to see how you can tackle problems at the level of a system. If I could jump to one of the other questions in there, I believe Chelsea, thanks for the question. Chelsea asked the question about narratives of systems change. I was thinking that one of the pieces of research we are looking at is how the use of vocabulary of systems change is important within this space. Paulo and I, one of the things we are looking at is, yes, the use of the nomenclature of systems change. When do people talk of systems? When do people talk of systems change? So when we speak of the vocabulary of systems change, we are not just talking about the dictionary. We're not just talking about the nomenclature. We are also talking about the frameworks that people use for systems change. And in different parts of the world, is it that different parts of the world use different frameworks to discuss systems change? How do we use those in order to bring stakeholders together and tackle problems? So that is one of the things that we are working on, and that I think is a very good question as well.
Thanks, Sudhir. Sorry, can I just jump in there and say that we're also working with Miriam Pasha, who's from X Equals and TEDx London, and we look at very much about how narratives and storytelling plays an important role in changing hearts and minds on being able to tackle systems change and sort of like communicate and share those examples of what's working and how to address complexity within systems by understanding multiple perspectives in systems change. So we are having a session with her on the 27th of October as part of the Impact Lab Open Series.
Yeah, at the Systems Change Observatory, we're looking a lot at language, but we are mostly looking at language as reflecting something else. So let's look at how language is an indicator to see how priorities of different organizations are changing, or how they change the way they allocate their resources, or how they measure impact. That's pretty much how we are approaching narratives. But as Bronwyn said, there's a bunch of people working on narratives as means of communicating changes in the self, but also changes with like broader stakeholders. should we jump to the next question?
There's a question here by Shri, which is really around one of the first questions on the chat, Paulo, around the research that you're doing about the different classifications and groupings around the institutions on systems change. And does this reflect sort of how the institution started, maybe during those times, or is it more about improving access, but now it needs more innovation? So the way that the organizations conceptualize systems change, is it an indication of where they came from or the kind of innovation where they're going? I don't know, Shri, is that what you're trying to ask?
Well, Shri, thanks for the question. And it's exactly what we are looking at this moment. We want to capture a bit this diffusion of systems change. What came earlier? So for example, like they were talking a lot about scaling solutions. Why did they change to systems change? What does that reflect in the ways they behave, the organizations they fund, right? So it's, we're exactly interested in understanding over time what changed with the adoption of systems change as a framework for action for investments. We don't really have an answer now. We're doing a bunch of interviews with people who have an institutional memory of the social impact space, who have worked in this space for over 20 years. And we have some very preliminary observations, and some of them are related to the observation of failures in the social impact space that not necessarily what they were investing would like yielded what they expected from the beginning, but also a lot of interconnected players that started engaging with each other. So some key organizations that started using systems change, bringing these lenses, they started meeting and it started building a field around systems change. But more on that later. Hopefully in a few months, we can give you a better update.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Sudhir, as well. I think we're gonna stop the Q&A there, but thank you for your questions. We do hope to have a Twitter chat later on in the year, and we'll invite you all to participate in that. Before I close, I'm just gonna hand over to the director of the Skoll Centre, Peter Drobak. He wanted to share a few words with us.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Paulo, Sudhir, thanks. That was awesome. Totally unsurprising and yet totally awesome. Thanks for that. It was a great overview of such an important concept and something that we're going to come back to over the course of the year. And, you know, all of you out there are really lucky because this is, you know, cutting edge, unpublished work that you're getting a glimpse into that that Sudhir and Paulo and Mark Ventresca and others are doing. So thank you for sharing it. I want to mention one thing, and again, we're going to come back to lots of this stuff. This whole conversation is getting me really jazzed about Impact Lab and GoTo, which we're getting set for next year. But I wanted to come back to a question that was asked a minute ago about successful examples of systems change, because there's a cool opportunity coming up, and it's another healthcare example. The example of polio eradication or near eradication is a good one. Another, I would argue, is the global AIDS movement, and that is how we as a world moved from one in which AIDS was a death sentence for 99% of people who were infected around the world, despite having access to a safe, effective, scalable treatment. Right, and that was the status quo in, say, 1998. There wasn't even a thought or a hope that most people with AIDS could ever have access to these treatments that those of us in the U.S. would have access to. And you fast forward about 5 years, and we saw this massive shift to creating global funding mechanisms to scale up AIDS treatment worldwide. You know, new kinds of knowledge happening, and a real shift in everyone's kind of baseline status quo mental model assertions that, you know, everybody with AIDS deserves a shot at treatment. And how that happened is a fascinating story, and it exemplifies a lot of these different pathways that Paulo talked about. It required a social movement, and that was driven in part by the LGBTQ community in the US, the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, and other pockets around the world. It required social entrepreneurs to kind of disrupt the status quo and show new paths forward. And it required, smart business types to rethink incentives and fix broken market structures, and it required political leadership to build new mechanisms. So all of these different forces had to converge to absolutely and radically changed the world in what actually was a fairly short period of time. One of the reasons I mention all of this is because this example is captured really beautifully in a film that I worked on called Bending the Arc, and I'll just put up into the chat. And came out a couple of years ago, and it's coming to Netflix in about 2 weeks' time. And so the whole world really gets to see it because it was just sort of theatrical. There's going to be a global launch event with an amazing panel discussion that's quite late, but what I'd love to do is first highlight it for you, and if there's interest, it'd be great to set up maybe like a virtual watch party and a discussion around it, because it's an organization that I worked with for about 15 years in a film that I worked on, and it would be happy to kind of speak to some of the lessons about how social entrepreneurship works and how systems change happens. So thank you. And sorry, thank you again to Paulo and Sudhir, and thank you to Bronwyn for organizing, and Lydia for making things happen behind the scenes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And thanks to all of you coming. Way to go on all the masks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter.